Mr. Regan, I would like to welcome you in Greece and to thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you.
You're a great thinker and philosopher in the issue of animal rights. What was the main motive for engaging with this issue?
When I was growing up, I lived in a poor family, and my mother and father stopped going to school when they were 14 years old because they had to go get a job to help their families survive. And for them, meat meant something more than food. When they were able to buy meat, poor people that they were, this was a sign of success. And especially for my father, who was the principal breadwinner, as we say in America. So I grew up in a home where we ate meat every day of the week, several times a day. And when I was going off to college, I mean, it was not anything unusual for me to work as a butcher. And so I sliced and I diced and I minced and I sawed, and the cold flesh of those animals just conformed to my hard will, and I thought nothing about it. So for Tom Regan to become an animal rights advocate, to me, means anybody can become an animal rights advocate. What happened in my life was twofold that changed me, or began the process of change. One was the war in Vietnam, which I know is ancient history, if history at all, to people in Greece today. But at the time, it was a very important issue in America. And I decided, along with Nancy, my wife, that to do something against the war. We thought the war was wrong, and we wanted to end it. And what I decided was I would try to contribute something as a philosopher, rather than just marching in the streets. And that led me to one day be in my university library looking for a book, the title of which was an autobiography, the story of my experiments with truth. And this book was written by a person whose name I had heard, but I didn't know much about. His name was Mohandas K. Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi. And what Gandhi taught me was that it was not enough to oppose violence when it was unjustified against human beings. It was also necessary to oppose violence when animals were the victims. And this is a thought, of course, I had never thought of, because I grew up in that meat culture of my family, worked as a butcher. There's something wrong with eating meat? I mean, this is an absolutely foreign idea to me.
So he was a teacher for you?
Yeah. So, but I thought about it, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the fork is a weapon of violence. The fork is a weapon of violence, or it can be anyhow. It depends on what's on the other end of it. And when we use the fork to eat the dead flesh, the rotting flesh of animals, it is a weapon of violence. So that was the beginning of my odyssey.
Now you write books and you support and you promote animal rights. Many modern thinkers and philosophers have many objections over the animal rights. They say that the meaning of right is acceptable only for human beings, that only human beings have rights, and that the meaning of right is not a part of nature, it's a human discovery. What do you believe about that?
When people ask me what I think about the notion of rights and whether the notion of rights is restricted to human beings, It's certainly restricted to human beings in that we, amongst all the species we know of, only human beings are capable of understanding what rights are. Cats and dogs, frogs and dolphins don't understand what rights are. So there is a certain sense in which it's true that human beings are in a unique position. But just because we are the only ones who understand something doesn't mean that we're the only ones who have something. So far as I know, we are the only species, some of whose members know about physiology, know about geology, know about astronomy, and the like. But in the case of physiology, for example, we don't say, well, because human beings are the only ones who understand physiology, other animals don't have a physiology. We don't say that. I mean, other animals do have a central nervous system, do have a brain, do have nerves, do have a heart, do have organs, do have sensory senses. And so the idea that we're the only ones who understand something doesn't in any way entail that we're the only ones who have something. And the same applies in the case of rights, therefore.
Despite there's a rising awareness over human rights from more and more people.
For human rights?
For animal rights.
Animal rights, okay.
From more and more people the last years across the planet, the living conditions of the most animals are deteriorating as time passes by.
Right.
Which is the main reason for this worsening?
When people ask me what's the main reason for the conditions of animals deteriorating, I think the one-word answer is money. Animals, because they cannot speak for themselves, because they cannot march in the streets, can't vote, can't elect political representatives. I mean, they are absolutely powerless when it comes to having their interests represented, except for human beings who step forward to do that on their behalf. But because they can't do it for themselves, because the 50 billion animals who are slaughtered every year worldwide, not counting sea life, 50 billion. In my country, it works out to over 1 million animals are killed every hour of every day, 365 days a year. And we ask, well, why is this happening? It's money, on the one hand. I mean, if you're a manufacturer, it only makes economic sense to produce maximize your profits, maximize production, spending the least amount of money. And the way you do that when it comes to animals to maximize production is you minimize investment by making them live in closer and closer and closer and smaller conditions. You reduce the cage size, for example, of hens, laying hens, and instead of having a cage where they can turn around, forget about that. The question is, you have a cage size the size of a newspaper when you open a daily newspaper, and in that space will be 7 or 8 hens who live for a year in those conditions, unable to turn around, unable to stretch their wings, unable to exhibit any of their normal behaviors, and at the end of which they're killed, slaughtered, and turned into soup, chicken noodle soup, something like that. So the reason that the conditions are deteriorating is because the demand for meat is very high, and the manufacturer is going to reduce investment, and that means reducing size, and that means making life more and more miserable for the animals who are raised for human consumption.
Many people who try to undermine the issue often have a very common question for the defenders of animal rights. They say, there are too many people that are starving, there are too many people that are being tortured by totalitarian regimes around the world. There are too many problems for the human rights.
Mm-hmm.
So you are fighting for the animal rights. What's your opinion about that? Your answer in this question, very common question.
Animal rights advocates often encounter the charge that there are more important things that we should be thinking about. All these human problems in terms of the violations of human rights in totalitarian regimes, for example, or the children dying of AIDS in Africa, and so on. And there are two things that I think when I hear this. One is almost always when people raise this objection, they're not doing anything to address the human problems. It's not like they're sacrificing their quality of life or giving up their time or making, really deep donations to those who are trying to help the children or trying to help the victims of totalitarian regimes. These people are out golfing on or yachting or playing soccer or something. They're not doing anything to improve the lot of the human beings that they mention. So there's a certain hypocrisy that I find quite commonly in those who raise this objection. But the second thing is that it's not an either-or proposition. It's not like you say, well, either I'll do something for the children who are victims of AIDS in Africa, or I'll do something to help animals, or either I'll do something to help the victims of totalitarian regimes, or I'll do something. You can do both. You can stop wearing the skin and the feathers and the flesh of animals. You can stop buying cosmetics that have been tested on animals. You can stop eating their dead, rotting flesh, and also work for the victims of AIDS and children in Africa and the victims of totalitarian regimes. It's not an either-or proposition.
Mm-hmm. How do you believe that we can promote the legal protection? The legal protection, which
the legal
is
protection,
the best way
right.
for the legal protection of animal rights.
Right. When it comes to the legal protection of animal rights, when it comes to passing legislation that genuinely protects animals, that's always going to be a difficult proposition, a difficult challenge. It's going to be because we don't have money. We don't have the kind of money that the meat industry has. We don't have the kind of money that the pharmaceutical industry has. We don't have the kind of money that the hunting lobby has. And politicians, there's a saying in America that those who pay the piper calls the tune. That is, if you pay the piper, then you can tell the piper what tune to play. Play that song for me. Oh, if you're paying, I'll play that song. Well, politics is like that. Those who have the money can tell the politicians how to vote. The biggest hurdle we face then as animal rights advocates in terms of trying to pass legislation is we don't have the money.
So they pay the music.
Yeah. But having said that we don't have the money, we can form coalitions with other nonprofit social justice movements, and we can become a significant voting bloc when it comes to elections. We can decide who wins and who loses. Not just by ourselves, but by forming those sorts of coalitions. And once we form those coalitions, and once we elect people who are like-minded, then we can see legislation passed But only then, not before then, only then.
You classify the animal rights advocates in Da Vincians, Damascans, and muddlers.
Yeah.
Can you tell me some more things about this?
Really? All right. Well, different people become animal rights advocates for different reasons. Some people, it seems to me, are just born that way. Once they understand where a lamb chop comes from, or where a pork chop comes from, they say, oh, I don't eat my friends. Animals are my friends. I don't eat my friends. And you don't have to argue with them or try to persuade them or whatever. Leonardo da Vinci was like that. He, from an early age, realized what animal flesh was, and he just stopped. He just stopped. I'm sure it was not an easy time for his family when he made that decision. So I think some people are like Da Vinci. They're just kind of born that way. Then there are some people who have a dramatic experience, like Saul on the road to Damascus, where, so the story goes, Jesus spoke to him from the heavens saying, "Why, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And on the basis of that single experience, Saul became Paul. Saul, the principal detractor of Jesus, became Paul, the principal apostle of Jesus. Like that. And then there are people who become animal rights advocates not because of some dramatic event in their life like Saul on the road to Damascus, but they read something or they see something or they have a conversation with somebody. And for them it's like water coming to the boil in a kettle, It just keeps getting warmer. They keep moving towards, and then eventually they say, "Oh my gosh, animals don't exist for me to wear or to entertain me or to compete with or to kill or to experiment on or to consume." So it's different people. The muddlers are people who just muddle along, one thing at a time. But eventually the water boils. Eventually, if they complete the journey, they say, "Oh, that's who they are." In other words, they just see animals entirely differently.
Do you think they are the majority, muddlers?
I think amongst the people I've known over the time in the animal rights movement, most are muddlers. Most are not like Da Vinci born with that sensitivity, and most not like Saul on the road to Damascus have this event that changes their life. They just muddle along.
Isn't it difficult to be a Da Vincian or maybe a Damascan in an urban environment when you live in a city? I think it's difficult to be a Da Vincian or a Damascan.
Living
in a city.
Living in a city, yeah. Living in a city, as most of us do, animals, except for our companion animals, and except for the animals wandering on the streets, most animals are invisible. They don't exist. We don't see them. I'm sure that not far from here there is some slaughterhouse. That'd be my estimation, because not far from anywhere in the world there's a slaughterhouse. But people don't know where it is. No ordinary person doesn't know where it is, doesn't know what happens. Not far from here there are laboratories where animals are being used in various forms of research, where animals day in and day out are having their limbs cut off, or are being blinded, or being subjected to heroin and cigarette smoke experiment, and are being scalded and burned day in and day out. Not far from here, not far from anywhere in the world, this happens. But it's invisible. People don't know it's happening. So yeah, I think living in a city we're like almost live on another planet when it comes to what's happening to other animals, even though it's not far from here.
How do you believe that we can become more and more aware on the issue of animal rights? How can we persuade the people for the issue of animal rights?
When I talk with activists about what do we do, what should we do, and there are a lot of different things we can do, obviously. I normally say the three most important things for any activist to do are educate, educate, educate. The people who live in cities for whom animals are invisible, what's happening to them on farms and in labs and in circuses and the like, for those people, what's preventing them from doing anything about it is not knowing anything about it. So our first obligation, I think, is to educate people about what's happening. How do you do that? Well, there are countless ways. You have programs like you're producing here. You have work on the internet that exposes conditions of animals. You leaflet, and so on. And the most important thing in all this process, of course, on my view anyhow, is for activists not to become part of the problem. There are two things to remember. One is people can't hear you when you're yelling at them. So if you try to educate a person by humiliating the person, by screaming at them about how they lack humanity and how terrible they are and so on, that's a non-starter. I mean, that just pushes that person further back in the cave of ignorance, or the cave of darkness. I mean, that makes it worse, harder to reach that person. And the second thing to remember for activists is that the last thing we want to do is to provide that person with another reason for not caring about animals. And that's exactly what we do if we treat them disrespectfully, because they'll just walk away. Not because they've learned anything about what's happening to animals, but because we've offended them. In a simple message, my simple message is that we have to love people into the movement, not hate people into the movement. And the more hate exudes from us, the more anger exudes from us, the worse it is for animals. It's very easy for an animal rights advocate to blame other people for what happens to animals. It's very easy. We kind of have a habit of that, almost a profession of it. But it's unfair to other people, because if our behavior is inappropriate to the cause, remember we're trying to promote nonviolence to animals and to people. If our behavior is inappropriate to our cause, then we are responsible for what's happening to animals.
Are many people offensive when you say that?
I wouldn't want to create the impression that all or even most people who are speaking out for animal rights are belligerent to the people who don't agree with them, or offensive to people who don't agree with them. But I will say that I've known plenty of them who are that way, and I understand that. It's something that animal rights advocates care so deeply, so profoundly, so sympathetically about the mistreatment, about the horrible mistreatment of animals who, as I said, have no voice, no power, no constituency. They're just innocent victims of human avarice and ignorance and greed and terrible things. So it's a perfectly natural thing to really feel angry about and towards other people. But that's not going to help other animals. It's not going to help them at all. It's just going to make things worse.
You mentioned before the hunting lobby in the United States. What's your opinion about hunting?
The hunting lobby in America is very powerful. It's connected with the National Rifle Association. And the National Rifle Association is a very, very powerful political force in America. If you run on a platform that's against the NRA, the National Rifle Association, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. So even in the most recent presidential election in America, when President Obama was elected, he made it clear that he wasn't going to say you can't hunt, and he wasn't going to interfere with your right to own a gun and stuff like that. Very powerful in America. But when it comes to hunting, I mean, it's the strangest thing, because the way it's represented to the general public is that hunting is a fine thing because the species are over multiplying, and we're doing them a favor by doing the environment a favor by killing them, blah, blah, blah. That's roughly the argument. But if you actually look and see, well, what do hunters kill? What they want to kill anyhow, are specimen animals. They want to kill the deer with the biggest antlers, and they want to prove their manhood by killing some really big animal. I mean, honestly, if you look in their magazines and look in there are these guys with these big grins on their face because they killed this animal with all these antlers. And it has nothing to do with killing the lame and the weak and those who are going to die in the winter. They're not doing the animals any favor. I personally have always thought that any man who kills an animal has doubts about his sexual competency. In fact, I'm pretty sure of that.
You're emphasizing all the time in the thought and the meaning of the right. I would like to return to our first questions, in some of our first questions, and ask your opinion about the experiments that use animals.
Right. It's interesting for animal rights advocates to try to navigate the terrain from one issue to another issue. So that, for example, when we come to like fur, and we ask for a justification for somebody wearing fur, where the animals are raised on fur farms, which means they're raised in cages in terrible conditions, and you say, well, how do you justify that? And it just seems pretty obvious to most people that when you stop and think about it, it really is hard to justify raising those animals in misery for their whole life so that someone can wear some fashionable garment. I mean, it's an easy case. And similarly, in the case of like eating meat, you don't need to eat meat. I mean, in fact, it's not good for you at the rate that people normally eat it. You can make that argument. But when it comes to research, comes to the question about using animals in research, you say, oh, see, we're talking something really important here. We're talking life-saving matters. It's not a question of fashion or do I have to eat meat? No, we're talking about saving lives. Well, there are two ways to go here, I think, at least. One is to ask the question, is relying on what's called the animal model, using the animal as a model for humans, is that the best way to go if what we're trying to do is to save human lives and promote human health? And I think the answer is clearly no. And this is something that individuals have to figure out for themselves after they've done some reading and looked at it. But I mean, if you look at just simply the use of drugs, therapeutic drugs, for various human ailments, all these drugs have been tested on animals. It's mandatory. There's no drug on the market, prescription drug on the market, that hasn't been tested on an animal. And so you say, well, what happens when you test the drugs on animals? Nothing to do with animal rights, just as a matter of fact what happens. And the more you look at it, the more you realize this, that the animal model is a very bad predictor of what's going to happen when a human being takes the drug. Because here we have this extensive drug development using animals, and then we enter what's called a phase 1 of human test. Now I know you're going to find this hard to believe, but 95 out of every 100 drugs that have passed animal tests, that is, they've been shown to be therapeutic and non-toxic, that is, they produce more benefits than harms. 95 out of every 100 of those drugs, when given to a small batch of human beings, several hundred human beings, 95 out of every 100, prove to be toxic to humans who take them. They actually are toxic to them. They who knows what the effects are going to be. They make you blind. I mean, they paralyze you. You die. I mean, there are terrible things that happen, even though the drugs have been proven safe. So now we have 5 drugs that have made through the first phase, and we give it to another batch of human beings in what's called phase 2. And what happens to those 5? 4 out of every 5 fail because they're toxic to human beings. Now we've got 99 out of every 100 drugs that are therapeutic for animals, or toxic, or killing and laming and blinding and whatever, destroying the kidneys and the liver and the heart of human beings. This is not good science. This is not doing anything to promote human health and longevity. It's a sham. It's a sham. And so what we ask then the question, the natural question, well, why do we keep doing this? Money.
Money again.
Money. Because the pharmaceutical industries have an enormous investment in animal research. I mean, if you told them tomorrow to stop doing it, and they stopped doing it, they would lose money, incalculable amounts of money. It's not human health that drives the vivisection industry. It's money.
Do you believe that the theory of the rights, as for the animals, is extended to the natural and the mineral sources? Do they have the same rights? Do they must have the same rights as the animals?
As minerals and
mineral
plants?
And, yes, and natural resources.
Okay.
All
when we think about our rights as human beings, the 3 rights that I think of are our right to liberty, our right to bodily integrity, our right to life. Those are 3 of our primary rights. And I think about those in terms of human rights, and I say, what is there about being a human being that helps make sense of those rights, bodily integrity and life and liberty? And it's the idea, I think, that we are not only in the world, we're aware of the world. And we're aware of what happens to us. And what happens to us matters to us because it makes a difference to the quality and the duration of our life. We are somebody and not something. We have a biography and not simply a biology. We are, as I use this expression in my writings, we are the subjects of a life. You know, we're not only alive, there's somebody behind this life who is us, whose life is unfolding. And so our right to liberty and bodily integrity and life is to be understood against that backdrop of who we are in the world. I think about the animals who are raised for food, the animals who are turned into clothes, turned into competitors, turned into clothes and like tools, like in science. And I think about them and I say, you know what? They are like us. They're somebody, not something. They have a biography, not simply a biology. They're in the world, aware of the world, what happens in their world, aware of what happens to them, and what happens to them matters to them because it makes a difference to the duration and the quality of their life. They're the same as we are. They're no different than we are. Now I think about minerals, rocks, marble, quartz. There's no subject there. There's nobody there. There's nobody whose life is unfolding. I think about plants again, and you think about, is there anybody there in the ear of corn, in the head of broccoli? You know, I don't think so. I don't think there's any good reason to think that there is a subject of a life behind plants.
We have often heard about the term environmental ethics. Do you agree with this term? Do you think is insufficient or maybe pointless, environmental ethics?
Environmentalists, okay. People who are working to preserve the environment and animal rights advocates frequently have the same agenda, frequently have shared interest. Those people who are trying to preserve our vanishing rainforest throughout the world, those people may have this view, see, that it's the ecology of that network of life, that community of life, that's important to preserve. So that's where they're coming from. Animal rights people, because they focus on the rights of animals, are going to think a little differently. They're going to say, the reason we need to preserve the rainforest is in order to preserve the life community in which the animals can survive and multiply and have a full life. So the focus will be a little different. I mean, the environmentalists will be on the whole system, the ecosystem, and the animal rights people will be on the individual animals, but they'll be working for the same thing, save the rainforest, but for different reasons. So I think the important thing, despite our differences, is to emphasize our commonality. And that's very important politically, again, because environmentalists all by themselves are a one-legged stool. And animal rights people all by themselves are another one-legged stool. And even when you put them together, they're a two-legged stool. So, I mean, you've got to build coalitions with other interest groups if you're going to do anything to save the rainforest, for example, just to take that as an example.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a conflict between these differences inside the environmental ethics? For example, some ecologists say different things and have a conflict with the defender of animal rights.
Mm-hmm.
I'm asking you because here in Greece there's a big conflict between different sections of the same target.
Sure. Despite the fact that there are cases where environmentalists and animal rights advocates are working for the same thing but for different reasons, there are also going to be cases where they're going to be in conflict with one another. It's just a plain fact. So that, for example, environmentalists very often will favor hunting as a means of controlling the number of animals in a given ecosystem in order to bring about a certain kind of balance. So that means what they're saying is you can go out and take your big high-powered rifle or your bow and just blow away an animal and be doing the right thing. You'll be doing the right thing by doing that if it's something that's going to help promote the harmony, stability, and balance of the ecosystem. From an animal rights point of view, no. I mean, that's not the way you interact with nature. So, yeah, there are going to be conflicts. And hunting is I think, one of the most obvious examples where environmentalists will part company with animal rights advocates. But the interesting thing to me is, at least up until this day, this time when I'm speaking, the interesting thing to me is that the vast majority of environmentalists are meat eaters. And yet there's nothing that does more destruction to the environment than meat production, not only in terms of the immediate environment in which animals are raised, but in terms of the consequences of the method of agriculture. Remember, 50 billion animals a year, not counting sea life, marine life, are being killed in the world, and they've got to be raised somewhere. And in the case of some animals, I mean, they emit methane gas. In fact, the methane gas is the #1 contributor to
So gases.
Yeah, to what we're concerned about. Yeah, and what's interesting is that I've sat down and had dinner with many environmentalists who are eating steak and so on and professing their concern about the environment. A real environmentalist would be a vegetarian at a minimum and perhaps more, perhaps a vegan. A real environmentalist. But they don't embrace that challenge. Al Gore, who did his presentation on An Inconvenient Truth, won an Oscar for it. He goes through this thing. It's a very impressive thing. He never mentioned, not one word, about what animals contribute to global warming. Mm-hmm. Not one word.
You mentioned the money and the way system works in the industry, in the politics. How can we promote the case of animal rights and the environmental needs through an economic system that lives with the interests of the environment exploitation and of the animals exploitation? How can we cope with this economic system and with these great interests?
it's not enough for individuals to make life-altering choices. For example, to say, I'm not going to wear leather. That's a very important thing to do, but that really doesn't change anything in terms of the system. The system's not geared to change because of the choice of a single individual. If I don't wear leather, that doesn't make any difference in how much leather is produced. It doesn't make any difference. And the same is true in the case of if I don't eat chicken, for example. That's not going to save a chicken because the system is not geared. It's not like, oh, Tom Regan didn't eat a chicken. Oh, well, we have to produce one less chicken. No, it doesn't work like that. You know, I mean. So what we know is that in order for our choice to make any difference, it's got to be a choice made in common with a lot of other people. A lot of other people. And the more people, the more it makes a difference. So that's why I think our fundamental challenge is to grow the animal rights movement. That is, to increase its numbers if we're to have any effect at all. That's our number one challenge. It really is. But even then, even if we grow the numbers so that we can have an economic impact, and as we actually, I think we can point to examples where this is true. In the United States, for example, the manufacture of tofu and soy products has certainly expanded because of the number of people who are not eating meat and are eating that product. So it's made an economic difference. But even that's not enough. What has to happen finally is that, as economists say, externalities need to be internalized. That's the way they talk, not the way I talk. And what that means is that if your industry is contributing to greenhouse gas, you're going to have to pay for that. Not the consumer. Not the consumer. You're going to have to pay for that. And we're going to have to figure out how you're going to have to pay. In other words, we're going to have to tax people who are contributing to environmental degradation. They're going to have to pay for that. They can't have its free ride, which is what has characterized this in the past, their behavior in the past. They're going to have to pay for that. And similarly, in terms of the treatment of animals, they're going to have to pay for that. If they want to continue to do that, we're going to tax them. But we're only going to do that. We're only going to be able to do that. Say you're going to have to pay for that. We're only going to be able to do that if our numbers are strong enough to elect people who take that ideology with them to the legislator.
So it's a matter of political decision.
Yeah.
And political activism.
Yeah.
Something like the Greens here in Europe.
Yeah. So a model for what the political force that needs to be brought to bear to make our choices mean something rather than be dismissed is the Green Party in Europe. We don't have a Green Party in the United States. I mean, nothing to speak of anyhow. We just basically have a two-party system. But the Green Party in Europe has been a visionary party, and I remember reading the initial manifesto of the Green Party, and it was very strong when it came to animal rights, very strong when it came to animal rights. And I know that the Green Party in Greece has an animal rights division. I'm not sure that's the right word, or a committee or something, but animal rights is part of the Green Party's platform, ideology in Greece. You people are the model for those of us who live in America to follow. You are trailblazers when it comes to this. we're far, far behind what you're doing. Far, far behind what you're doing. But at the same time, it's important to realize that even in America, animal rights advocates can win an election. They can be the difference between winning and losing. And in the most recent election, President Obama won by a fairly comfortable margin. He had vast backing from the animal rights community. And he was in office only a matter of days, and he did one thing to acknowledge his debt to animal rights advocates. He signed a piece of legislation that said, if an animal reaches a slaughterhouse and that animal can't stand up, that animal must be humanely euthanized on the spot and not taken into the slaughterhouse. Up until then, it was perfectly legal to take what we call downers, animals who are down and can't get up. It was perfectly legal to drag them into the slaughterhouse and slaughter them for human consumption. And we had fought for decades to prohibit that. And with the stroke of the pen, President Obama, acknowledged his debt to the animal rights community for his victory.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're at the end. Would you like to add something or add an answer for me, something which wasn't answered, something you have to mention and you consider it important?
I think it's important for animal rights advocates to understand that advocacy is a lifetime commitment. During the 40 years that my wife and I have been involved in the struggle for animal rights, we've met many, many wonderful people. And we've met many wonderful people here in our first visit to Greece. And some during that time, 40 years is a long time, during that time some of them have passed away. And we've lost them. But many more have just left the movement. And well, they had their reasons, you know. Could be that a death in the family, a change of job, the birth of a child, the loss of a job. And they've had their reasons, but they've left. They're no longer active. That can't continue. I mean, that cannot continue. I mean, if you have a movement that's trying to attract new people and that's losing old people faster than it can attract new people, then it's going backwards rather than forward. The most important thing I have to say to any animal rights activists today, then, is that you need to be an animal rights activist tomorrow, and the next day, and the next.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I hope to see you again in Greece.
Yeah,
and wish you the best.
Yeah.